Greetings and thank you for tuning into my latest video. It's Gordon Causey, as it always is, and I'm going to be talking tonight or today about the news that dropped over the last 24 hours. It came out on Sunday that Donald Trump is openly speculating about possibly trying to stick around for a third presidential term. Today, right now, I'm publishing this video on Monday, the 31st of March 2025. And some might be wondering, well, why does a Canadian care about the American political sphere, the American political landscape? We have our own election going on in this country. We'll be going to the polls on April 28th. Well, Canadians, we are a curious lot. Right now, we're embroiled in an election campaign where the main talking point seems to be over differentiating ourselves from our American neighbors, from our American friends, and elbows up. And there's a lot of animosity going on between Americans and Canadians right now. Sadly, that's my take on it. I have a great deal of affection for the United States of America, warts and all, because goodness knows Canada is far from perfect either. But if you were to walk down a Canadian street anywhere, in any Canadian city, and were to ask 100 people who the president of the United States is, 100 of them, at worst, it would be 99, would tell you Donald J. Trump. Canadians know who the president of the United States is. And I would wager, though, that if you walk down the streets of American cities and pose the same question about Canada, who is the Prime Minister of Canada, I bet you less than half would know that as things currently stand here in March, April 2028, probably less than half would know that it is actually Mark Carney who is Prime Minister of Canada. And even when it was Justin Trudeau, I imagine, there would be a significant number of Americans who would not know that Justin Trudeau was the prime minister. And I think that would hold true going back however far you wanted to go. We Canadians are far more fixated on what Pierre Elliott Trudeau once referred to as somewhat the elephant in the room. He said living next to the United States is like sharing a room with an elephant. The American economy is more than 10 times larger than the Canadian economy. When they sneeze, we get a cold. And population wise, we're 40 million. The US is probably somewhere in and around 340 million. Not quite 10 times as large, but pretty close, 8, 9 times the size of our population. And Canadians are fixated. We pay attention to what is happening in the United States of America. And so I'm going to give one Canadian's thoughts. I've labeled this, the subject line is Canadian musings on a third presidential term for Donald Trump. This isn't all of Canada, obviously. It's just one man's opinions. But I'm speaking as someone who did spend 10 years growing up in the United States. I am a Canadian citizen born in Port Colborne, Ontario, Canada, near Niagara Falls, Crystal Beach area. However, I lived in New York, New Jersey, Portland, Oregon. I went through kindergarten, grades 1, 2, 3, part of grade 4, finished grade 4 and 5 in Canada, finished grade 4 and did all of grade 5 in Canada, then did grade 6 in the United States. So I have a certain degree of understanding that a lot of Canadians perhaps don't have. A lot of Canadians who have spent their entire lives living in Canada. Most will be aware of the fact that there is a constitutional amendment concerning presidential terms. U.S. presidents are limited to 2 terms. Why is that? Why are American presidents limited to 2 terms? For the longest time, there was no constitutional prohibition on an individual running for a 3rd, 4th, 5th term. In Canada, we have often had prime ministers who have served more than 2 terms. Pierre Elliott Trudeau served more than 2. Jean Chrétien served 3 terms. Stephen Harper was elected 3 terms. Justin Trudeau served 3 terms, 3 parliamentary terms. Mackenzie King, William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was a wartime prime minister, I I think he was up in around 22 years. I think he won 4 or 5, maybe 6 elections. So, but in the United States, you're limited to two ever since 1951. That's when they brought in a constitutional amendment limiting a president to 2 terms. Prior to that, it was legal for an individual to run for a third and even a fourth term. And that did happen. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, first elected in 1932, reelected in 36, reelected again in 1940, and then reelected yet again in 1944. There was nothing to prevent him from, there was no constitutional limit on the number of times the president could run. What had happened was George Washington basically set the standard. Much of what George Washington did later became the accepted presidential norm because he was the first. He was the first president who set all the precedents, and one of the precedents that he set was he had served 2 terms as president, and there were even way back then. I forget exactly what year it was. It would have been in the late 1700s. He was approached about potentially becoming king. Why don't we make you king? But rather than become king, George Washington opted to, I think it's Martha's Vineyard was where he had his properties, and or Mount Vernon or wherever it is, and he went and he retired off into the sunset, and so we have this precedent of a president serving 2 terms. And from Washington all the way to FDR, no one even attempted to run for a third term. FDR was the first when in 1940, just before the US entered the Second World War, FDR ran for a third term, was reelected, and then ran again for a fourth term in 1944, and again was reelected. And it was only after that that the US brought an amendment into their Constitution. It's the 22nd Amendment that limits a president to 2 terms. And what I find interesting is in looking over the coverage, is that it's referred to as basically being unconstitutional, as if it could never change, which is fair enough. So it's written in stone, more or less, the way it's being presented, that Donald Trump is limited, and anyone would be limited to 2 terms in office. It's written in stone. It's in the Constitution. It's the 22nd Amendment. I'm going to juxtapose that, though, with another U.S. amendment, and that is the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is the one that famously guarantees Americans the right to bear arms, the necessity of having a well-trained militia to ensure liberty and security of the person, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the rights of the citizen, the rights of citizens to bear arms shall not be infringed. Second Amendment basically recognized that the potential is always there for a government to turn tyrannical and to erode the liberties and freedoms of its citizenry. And so the rights of the citizenry to bear arms shall not be infringed. And some Americans view that Second Amendment as sacrosanct, written in stone. You can never change it. But there's a large swath of Americans who would like to see the Second Amendment repealed or modified so that the state could take away an individual's right to bear arms, to own a gun. Well, when it comes to, and you can see the tension here, those who would willingly allow the Second Amendment to be changed will probably say they would never want the 22nd Amendment to be changed. We can change one amendment, but we can't change the other. And interestingly, of course, it plays the same way in reverse. Individuals who would want the 22nd Amendment changed would absolutely never want the Second Amendment changed. So you have a contradiction in a fashion that plays both ways. But obviously, an amendment can be changed. It does happen. The U.S. banned, they had prohibition, and then they repealed it. They repealed their prohibition laws that made it illegal to produce or consume or be in possession of booze. and they got rid of that. So you can make changes to the Constitution. I don't know the finer points, but broadly speaking, I believe that it first requires a two-third majority. Any proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution requires a two-thirds majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then in two-thirds of the states as well. And provided those thresholds are met, if you can get two-thirds of the House, two-thirds of the Senate, and then two-thirds of the states to approve an amendment can be amended. There's a famous Jim Jeffries, an Australian comedian, talking about if you can't change something called an amendment, it's called an amendment. You can't change something called an amendment. You don't need a constitution. What you need is a dictionary. Anyway, I'm sure many have seen that little routine. It's where he's actually taking the Second Amendment to task. Well, if you change the Second Amendment, then you could change the 22nd. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Trump has, in his musings, has said that it's too early at this juncture to talk about it, but it's obviously something that's on his mind, and I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. Donald J. Trump has an ego the size of, the Gulf of America or the Gulf of Mexico, call it whatever you want. Trump's ego is that big. He thinks he's the most popular, best, greatest president the U.S. has, he's the greatest leader the world has ever seen in his own eyes. He's a legend in his own mind. And myself personally, I tend to divorce Donald Trump from his policies. Some of the policies he's brought in, I like. Some of the policies he's brought in, I do not like. I like the fact that Donald Trump has recognized that there are two genders, male and female. Duh. Thank you for recognizing the basic fabric of reality. I consider it mind-blowing that you need a presidential edict, an executive order to recognize what is basic, obvious, fundamental reality. What's next? A presidential executive order stating that if you jump into a lake, you will get wet, or a presidential order saying that the freezing temperature of water is 0 degrees Celsius, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Do we really need a presidential executive order stating that there are two genders and that men cannot be allowed to compete in women's sports? That's a big one for me. The fact that we're getting back to common sense reality. Some things that I don't like that Trump has done. I'm not a fan of the fact that there's a protester at Columbia University, a foreign national, but one who has permanent resident status, has a green card, not on a visa, legally in the United States, exercising the right to free speech with respect to the wanting the nation state of Israel, wanting Columbia University to divest itself of all assets with ties to the nation state of Israel. And I don't agree with this individual. I don't agree with this student protester's point of view. But I do agree with this individual's right to express that point of view and to protest. Protest is vital in a liberal democracy. So that is one area that I do not like what the Trump administration has done. It's very complex. A lot of these issues, you can break them down. This talk of Trump wanting to annex Greenland, for example, or to bring it into the U.S., make it a U.S. territory. That's a complex issue because the U.S. is heading to an inflection point with the rising power of China, communist dictatorial China, and the need to control minerals, rare earths, and natural resources is going to be incredibly important in the years and decades to come. And it's something of a race right now between the Chinese and the Americans. And the Americans right now have the advantage, but China is coming up fast. And if America is to maintain its dominant position in the world, then they're going to have to make some hard decisions that may not seem nice on the surface. And speaking as a Canadian, I think Canada, we have to decide, do we want to be under in the American sphere of influence? Do we want to be under the American umbrella? Or conversely, do we want to line ourselves up with communist dictatorial China? And unfortunately, it's something like gender. It's a binary choice. It's one or the other. There are going to be two dominant powers in this world. And which one do Canadians want to be aligned with? And I, at some point, have to do a video talking about the rehabilitation of failed Marxist ideology. Marxism is it's on the rise. A lot of Canadians, a lot of Americans, a lot of Western people living in the Western world who live in democratic countries are being seduced by this utopian, I would say dystopian, but they view it as a utopian worldview, first espoused by the likes of Karl Marx and Engels, and then brought into practice by guys like Mao Zedong and Lenin, and followed by Stalin. We look down to Cuba, we can look down to Venezuela, and we can look and see how we have Marxist, the ideology, removed from real world events. And then we can see, okay, how does it work when it's applied in the real world? And we can see, do we want to live in a country like China or Soviet era Russia or communist Cuba? And at any rate, that's a video for a later day. But those are just my thoughts right now with respect to Trump running for a third term. Would he get elected? If they were able to change the amendment, there's talk that one way he could kind of get around things would be to have J.D. Vance run as president, with Trump running as his vice president. However, there is a constitutional prohibition on someone being able to run for the vice presidency if they are not qualified to be president. So in order to be on the running mate of a presidential candidate, in order to be the vice presidential candidate, according to the US Constitution, that individual has to be able to be the president. And it makes sense, because if anything happens to the president, think John F. Kennedy, then the vice president automatically steps into the role. So if Trump is not allowed to be president because he's limited to 2 terms, then he would not be able, according to the US Constitution, he would not be able to run as the vice president. Well, it's going to be an interesting situation. At the end of the day, the US is a democratic nation, and democracy at its core level means consent of the governed, means those who are being governed have consented. And there are a lot of Americans, probably not a majority, but there are still a significant number of Americans who are all in on Donald Trump, who are MAGA all the way, who would want him to be president for life. And the Constitution be damned. He's become a cult of personality. I don't think there's a significant enough number of Americans of that mindset for him to totally overhaul the US Constitution and throw it in the trash heap. But we'll find out. We'll find out. Is this great experiment coming to an end? Are we moving into an era? You have to remember the United States, 1776, 1783, fighting that war against Great Britain. British model was to be ruled by a king. The king had ultimate authority, and that morphed over time with their Magna Carta, and put some limitations on the king, but the king still had a lot of power. And the Americans, their experiment, their republic, was viewed as just that, a great experiment. It was something new, something the world had not seen before. You'd have to go back to ancient Greece and even in Rome, and even then, their system of democracy wasn't as all encompassing as the American model. And so if you look at the long thousands of years of recorded human history, 250 years is but a blip. Are we coming to an end? Anyway, I'll leave my thoughts there and invite you to comment down below in the comment section. Tell me whether you think I'm crazy or on the money or your own thoughts on the matter. What do you think of Donald Trump trying to run for re-election, or do you think it could happen? I think it's anything's possible in this world. But I'll leave you there, and I'll invite you also to like, share, and subscribe my videos, this one or any other. Um, I'm trying to build the channel as much as I can. I'm having a few issues, technical issues. My internet connection is not the best. I'm going to see if there's anything I can do to improve that. I don't know that there is. I live in a very rural area. Picture the CN Tower in the background there, notwithstanding. I'm well east of the GTA. I don't live near Toronto. I'm about 150, 200 kilometers away, about an hour after you get out of Oshawa, about an hour further east, another 100 kilometers or so down the road from Oshawa. And it's a very rural area, and the internet connectivity in this area, the connections are not the most robust. But that's a long digression. Thank you for watching, and hope to see you back. Take care, all.